Hi, I'm Heath, and it's another episode of Media Diet Comics Commentary. We are here today to talk about a handful of issues of the current Dynamite ongoing series, Red Sonja. Now, if you were going to read Red Sonja actively, the best time to have done so is probably in the late 70s, when, after a first appearance in Marvel Feature, there was a Red Sonja series drawn by Frank Thorne, later issues drawn by John Buscema, and Thorne's art is beautiful and has long been held as kind of the best Red Sonja art that there's been. In the later series that Marvel did, art got a little uneven, story got a little uneven, and Red Sonja kind of was revealed to be the sexist male fantasy figure that she was and has been. Originally a character created by Robert E. Howard in the same universe as his Conan the Barbarian character, basically a female counterpart to Conan and King Conan, generally depicted as a chainmail bikini clad warrior woman, but much more to the character, as we'll see kind of in this Dynamite series. Now, Dynamite's been publishing Red Sonja comics since the early 2000s, various ongoing series since about 2005, and how they've tried to address the kind of sexist elements of the character, because Red Sonja is actually a challenging character to read and to be a fan of as a male comics reader, just because of the sexism that's built into the character, particularly in the depictions of her as a figure. And how Dynamite has addressed that. Similar experience would be had with Vampirella. It's very hard to read Vampirella comics in public without feeling like a jerk. And how Dynamite has addressed it with Red Sonja, at least, is by having strong women writers write the strong women comic. And so Gail Simone wrote volume 2, Marguerite Bennett wrote some of volume 3, Amy Chu wrote the previous volume, volume 4, and this comic, while it's not currently helmed by a female creator, continues kind of that stream of, I wouldn't even say sensitivity, but just strong depiction of her as a female character, regardless of the physical depiction of her physical form. And so currently written by a fella whose name is Mark Russell. The first swing of issues was drawn by Bob Q. And then about midway through the run that I'll be commenting on, art switched over to Alessandro Miracolo. And then the last issue was drawn by Alessandro Miracolo and Vincenzo Federici. And again, if I mispronounce anything, let me know in the comments below, and I'll fix it for the beginning. And so, sexist depiction of women aside, the covers to this comic are absolutely beautiful. We're drawn by Jay Lee, colors by June Chung, and I just want to share those with you at the outset. And the run that I'm looking at is number 16 to number 21. And so that's about 6 issues. And this current series, volume 5, has been running since last year. The first volume, interestingly, ran like 80 issues or something like that. So they have a history of kind of relatively long-running ongoing series as well as miniseries. But Jay Lee's covers are just absolutely beautiful. And again, apologies for the chainmail bikini. But as you'll see once we start talking about the story, that is not why we read Red Sonja, at least in full. I'm sure some men do read Red Sonja for the chainmail bikini. But I just want to give some accolades and recognition to Jay Lee and to June Chung for the extremely highly stylized and just absolutely beautiful run of covers that they did. Not uncommon for comics like this. There's also a wide range of variant covers, which certainly do not help challenges of sexism and sexist depictions. Multiple artists, you can kind of see each issue. There's at least, let's say that's 14, 20 variant issues. Not all different art, but some uncolored, some raw, some without logo. And there's a cosplay cover. There's something called the Seduction variant. Again, Dynamite's not the worst publisher in terms of sexist variants, but it certainly doesn't help the comics reading cause. So what's the story, and what did we get from the writer, whose name I forget and want to remind you of, Mark Russell? So this is basically two series, the ending, two stories, the ending of one and the beginning of another. In the first one, Red Sonja finds herself in Katai with her bodyguard and lover Zoran, kind of in the service of King Jokan, who was an enemy, killed a mentor of hers, but through various misfortunes ends up in his service in Katai. And this story is interesting. We've got this sideline story in Zamora where a small child named Cyril, we later learn he's not so small, comes into play. But most of the story takes place in Kitai and is a story of the king Jokan with his eunuch advisor Tortoise. This storyline's very influenced by Game of Thrones, or just drinking from the same well, if you will. The eunuch advisor Tortoise, doesn't really think about right or wrong, but just thinks about math and plays the odds and determines responses to risks in that manner. But this storyline is about the King Jokan and Kitai basically recruiting an army of 12-year-olds that Red Sonja is then supposed to go into battle with. And so the main story in this issue and in subsequent issues is how she copes with leading an army of soldiers so young and so inexperienced, not wanting them to die and not wanting to kind of be responsible for their deaths. Number 16 and 17 are also interesting, though, because there is a story told in the comic by a character. And it is the story of a festival that's occurring in town that the population of Kitai is looking forward to. And that would be a festival commemorating the death of Idra, favorite daughter of King Gordal, back centuries before even the age of the three hands. And the story of Idra or Idra, daughter of the king, is a sad and challenging story. Basically, it's a story of incest and suicide and not being able to speak out against the person in power and the abuser in power. And so some interesting parallels to the leadership of today. One is unable to act against a king, so instead she chopped away the plaster hands of the servants. Idra was buried with plaster statues of servants to take care of her in the afterlife. Chopped away the plaster hands of the servants, that even in the afterlife they could never again deliver Idra to the king. And so, interesting story within a story, a powerful story within a story, fictional yet with the weight of what could have been a culture's actual legend and lore. The story continues in number 17, where through some duplicity and trickery, that army of children actually goes pretty well. And then she ends up facing an old friend of hers, General Holoferus, on the field as well. And the comic later comments on them being two generals in service of absentee landlords. And so this is a fight that neither of them wants, that neither of them would seek, but they are currently in service of people who are disagreeing, and so therefore are the hands of that disagreement. And so they're facing each other on the field, and she is able to work the battle in such a way, again through duplicity and trickery, that both of them can get out of it with their honor intact, even if the battle doesn't go in the direction that they would like to. And so then we return to Kitai, and the king, meanwhile, has taken back over the city that she had abandoned to go into the field, has gone out into the field with an army of his own, not going that well, not as strong a leader as Red Sonja is, and does not end well for the king. And so that's the end of that story. Those three issues, 16, 17, and 18, kind of end the storyline that's happening in Kitai. And then Sonja and Jokan, or Joran, her bodyguard and lover, what's his name? Although he won't be around too much longer, spoiler alert, Zoran, they're going to return to Hyrcania, where she is queen. So that takes us to numbers 19 through 21, which switches art to Alessandro Miracolo. And this storyline, I don't like Miracolo's art probably as much, but this run of stories is also interesting. And this is really funny because I have now set the screen timer twice in two different places, and it still turns off after 10 minutes. So if you have any advice on how to stop my display from turning off, let me know, and I will try more. So also interesting because there's another example of a story within a story. And so they're going to honor the citizens of Hyrcania, the dead of the city, with a night of stories. They are going to enlist a storyteller. Let's see. I thought the storyteller was named Caspar the poet. Cyril returns to Hyrcania. His mother, the empress, will be pleased. And the story that is told is a story of a king. King Julius boasting to his friend King Florin about his incredible luck. And this is Julius, the king of Argos. Boasted of incredible luck. Just everything he did was coming up roses. And received a warning from his friend and was so troubled by it that he removed his signet ring and cast it into the sea. And it was later found by a fisherman in a fish. So I won't tell you where the story goes from there, but depicted in the comic as a story being told by a poet and actors wearing masks in a performance. Another example of a relatively decent story told within the story. And so kind of a neat theme out of this run of Red Sonja. And then Cyril returns. His mother is pleased to see him. And it turns out that he was not who he thought he was. And I won't give that away in the name of not revealing a spoiler, but that's kind of an interesting story. How did he get to seem so much older and so much wiser? That issue tells you. So he sends a message back to Red Sonja. The war continues. There's some neat stuff. He's got this group of advisors, which are basically decapitated heads in a box called the Teraphim, that he's able to get advice and counsel from. He travels around with a talking boar that's depicted relatively cartoonily. He has a cruel streak like another character out of Game of Thrones. Battle returns to Aquilonia. And then interesting, this is kind of cool for those that play role-playing games, series of skirmishes. He's leading small battles, nothing big, not taking on any major forces, and the opposing leaders are kind of mystified by this. Why isn't he attacking the strongholds? Why isn't he not attacking the largest forces? And he's instead attacking these villages and towns, and they seem to be relatively pointless surgical strikes. What's going on? But then there's a point in the comic when they realize that every single blacksmith in Aquilonia has been killed. And so by the time that they realize what's going on and that they need to force to increase production of weapons, raise the army, order the smiths to double weapon production. Father, there's a problem. All these small raids, small as they were, I don't know how they did it, but every blacksmith in Aquilonia is dead. So just think for a moment at that time going after the forces of production and figuring out, okay, if you're going to go after the armies, don't go after the armies, go after the supply chain for the armies. So kind of interesting there. And then the last issue, which I think has perhaps one of the most beautiful of the covers, just with the lack of line work there and the color palette from June Chung. The last issue continues that storyline with the army. You've got another depiction of his decapitated head advisors. The boar is still around, and won't say too much more about that in the interest of time. Not as good a story as kind of the first story, in terms of the first 3 issues of this run of 6. The art's not as great, but a decent Red Sonja comic. Not a lot of fiction written by Howard about Sonja, so these aren't based on existing examples of fiction. These are new writings, and relatively decent. And she, in the comic at least, regardless of her physical depiction and the clothes that she wears with the chainmail bikini, is portrayed as a strong woman, a leader, a person of character, of honor, um, and is a really interesting and fun comic to read. And so if you haven't checked out Red Sonja for a while, check it out. The current volume, Volume 5, being published by Dynamite, is well worth reading, at least just for the Jay Lee covers. The Jay Lee covers are absolutely, absolutely beautiful. And we'll see where this storyline goes. Have a great day.